The official story was clear, unwavering, and repeated in every newspaper, every school textbook, every propaganda poster that lined the streets of Soviet cities from Leningrad to Vladivostok. Drug addiction was a disease of capitalist decadence, a symptom of Western moral decay that had no place in the workers' paradise being constructed under the hammer and sickle. The Soviet citizen, liberated from exploitation and guided by scientific socialism, was immune to such degradation. This was the narrative, this was the lie. Because beneath the surface of this carefully maintained illusion, the Soviet Union was fighting a losing battle against one of the most persistent and devastating social crises of the 20th century. A crisis that the state apparatus worked tirelessly to hide, minimize, and deny, even as it consumed lives across 11 time zones. The roots of Soviet drug addiction did not begin with the Soviet state itself, but emerged from the chaos that followed its violent birth. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 tore apart the old Russian Empire, plunging the vast territory into civil war, famine, and institutional collapse. In this vacuum of authority, the borders that had once been patrolled by Tsarist customs officials became porous, undefended lines on maps that meant nothing to the smugglers, traders, and desperate entrepreneurs who moved through them. Russia had always been a crossroads between East and West, positioned between the opium-producing regions of Central Asia and Persia and the consumer markets of Europe. When state control evaporated, that geographic reality asserted itself with brutal efficiency. Drugs that had once been luxury items, accessible only to the wealthy elite, suddenly flooded into cities and towns across the former empire. Cocaine, morphine, and opium ceased to be the exclusive domain of aristocratic salons and bohemian artists, and became commodities available to anyone with a few rubles and a desperate need to escape the nightmare of post-revolutionary Russia. Princess Tatiana Kurakina, writing from within this collapsing world, captured the surreal horror of the situation with stark clarity. "The scourge of all Soviet Russia is cocaine," she wrote, documenting a reality that would soon be erased from official memory. Although Russia is reduced to a state of complete impoverishment and needs decisively everything, but there is cocaine, and there is enough for everyone. This was not hyperbole. In the early 1920s, as millions starved and the Bolsheviks consolidated their grip on power through terror and forced requisitions, cocaine was easier to obtain than bread. The drug trade flourished in the ruins of the old order, creating a shadow economy that operated parallel to the struggling official markets. For many, drugs offered temporary relief from hunger, cold, trauma, and loss. For others, they represented one of the few remaining profitable businesses in an economy that had been deliberately dismantled and was being painfully reconstructed according to Marxist-Leninist principles. The early Soviet response to this crisis was characteristically brutal. The Bolsheviks, whatever their other failings, understood the threat that widespread drug addiction posed to their project of social transformation. A drugged population could not be mobilized for industrialization, collectivization, or defense. The state needed workers, soldiers, and loyal citizens, not addicts. Legislation passed in the early years of Soviet power reflected this pragmatic concern. Those caught speculating in or trading cocaine and opium faced draconian punishments. Prison sentences of up to 10 years became standard. In some cases, particularly egregious offenders were simply executed, their deaths serving as public warnings against involvement in the drug trade. This was the era of war communism and the Red Terror, when the Bolsheviks were willing to use unlimited violence to achieve their goals, and drug traffickers were treated as enemies of the revolution, no different from White Army officers or kulak saboteurs. Yet even this harsh approach could not eliminate the problem, and over time, the Soviet states' commitment to fighting drug addiction began to waver. The legislation that had once prescribed death or a decade in the Gulag was gradually softened. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, sentences for drug trafficking had been reduced to between 1 and 5 years, a significant retreat that reflected both the impossibility of enforcing the earlier laws and a shift in state priorities. Stalin's regime was focused on industrialization, collectivization, and the elimination of political enemies, real and imagined. Drug addiction, while acknowledged as a problem, was increasingly treated as a secondary concern, something that would supposedly resolve itself as Soviet society advanced toward communism. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define Soviet drug policy for decades. The problem would be acknowledged in internal documents and police reports, but minimized or ignored in public discourse. The ideological framework that emerged to explain and contain the drug problem was simple and self-serving. Drug addiction was classified as a relic of the bourgeois past, a holdover from the corrupt czarist regime and the chaotic early revolutionary period that would naturally disappear as socialism matured. This categorization allowed the state to avoid confronting the reality that drug addiction was not disappearing, but persisting, and in some regions growing even as the Soviet Union industrialized and urbanized. Instead of mounting a sustained campaign against drug abuse comparable to the massive efforts directed at alcoholism and tuniatstvo, the parasitic refusal to work that was criminalized under Soviet law, the authorities engaged with the drug problem only marginally. Resources were directed elsewhere. The propaganda apparatus focused on celebrating Soviet achievements and denouncing Western vices. Drug addiction became an invisible crisis, acknowledged in whispers but never discussed openly in newspapers, radio broadcasts, or official statistics. This official neglect had practical consequences that made the problem worse. Until the mid-1950s, opium, morphine, cocaine drops, and even heroin could be legally purchased in Soviet pharmacies with a doctor's prescription. This system, inherited from pre-revolutionary medical practice and maintained through bureaucratic inertia, created obvious opportunities for abuse. Addicts quickly learned to exploit the system, forging prescriptions or bribing corrupt doctors to obtain legal drugs. Others stole directly from hospitals and pharmaceutical warehouses, taking advantage of lax security and inadequate inventory controls. The Soviet healthcare system, chronically underfunded and overstretched, was ill-equipped to prevent such theft. Medications disappeared from supply chains, were diverted before reaching their intended destinations, or simply vanished from hospital storage rooms. For those unable to access pharmaceutical sources, alternative supply chains emerged. Some addicts established artisanal production operations, obtaining raw opium poppy from Central Asia, where it had been cultivated for centuries, or from Ukraine, where a variety known as samoseca grew readily. These small-scale producers operated in the shadows of the command economy, creating a parallel market that the state struggled to monitor or control. By the mid-1970s, the scale of the problem could no longer be entirely hidden, at least from internal security agencies. In 1976, the Ministry of Internal Affairs registered approximately 60,000 drug addicts across the Soviet Union. This figure, already alarming, represented only those individuals who had come to official attention through arrests, medical treatment, or police surveillance. The actual number was certainly higher, perhaps significantly so, as many addicts remained undetected or were classified under different categories in bureaucratic records. 4 years later, by 1980, the registered number had grown to 86,000, an increase of more than 40% in less than half a decade. These numbers revealed a trend that contradicted everything the Soviet state claimed about its social progress. Drug addiction was not a relic of the past fading away as socialism advanced. It was a growing crisis, spreading despite decades of official denial. The situation was dramatically worsened by a decision made thousands of kilometers away in the halls of the Kremlin that had nothing to do with drugs, but everything to do with geopolitics and ideology. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan, beginning what would become a decade-long military quagmire that drained resources, killed tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and fundamentally destabilized Central Asia. The Afghan War had many consequences, most of them catastrophic for the Soviet Union, but one of the least discussed and most enduring was its impact on drug trafficking. Afghanistan was and remains one of the world's largest producers of opium and its refined derivative, heroin. The war disrupted traditional smuggling routes, created new ones, and brought hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers into direct contact with Afghan drug producers and traffickers. Some soldiers, traumatized by combat and seeking relief from the horror of a war they did not understand and could not win, began using heroin themselves. Others became involved in smuggling, transporting drugs back to the Soviet Union through military supply chains that were subject to minimal oversight. The flow of Afghan heroin into Soviet territory, which had been a trickle before the war, became a steady stream during it. This influx of high-quality, relatively cheap heroin transformed the Soviet drug landscape. Previously, most Soviet addicts had relied on homemade opiates, pharmaceutical diversions, or expensive cocaine. Afghan heroin was more potent, more addictive, and more widely available than anything that had come before. It spread through Soviet cities, particularly in Central Asia and the southern republics, but also reaching Moscow, Leningrad, and other major urban centers. The addict population expanded beyond the traditional demographics of bohemian intellectuals, criminals, and marginalized individuals to include working-class youth, students, and even military veterans. The social profile of Soviet drug addiction was changing, becoming more diverse and more widespread, but the state's response remained inadequate and constrained by ideological rigidity. It was not until the late 1970s that the Soviet government began to intensify its efforts against drug addiction, and even then, the response was halting and inconsistent. New legislation was introduced, penalties were increased, and specialized treatment facilities were established, though these were often poorly funded and based on outdated medical models that emphasized punishment and isolation rather than rehabilitation. The Ministry of Internal Affairs expanded its anti-narcotics units, and the KGB became more involved in tracking international smuggling networks. Yet these measures, while representing an improvement over previous neglect, were insufficient to address the scale of the crisis. The Soviet system, with its emphasis on centralized planning and its aversion to acknowledging social problems that contradicted official ideology, was structurally incapable of mounting the kind of comprehensive, multifaceted response that the drug epidemic required. The real turning point came not from improved policy, but from political transformation. When Mikhail Gorbachev launched his programs of Glasnost and Perestroika in the mid-1980s, one of the many consequences was a loosening of censorship and a willingness to discuss social problems that had previously been taboo. For the first time in decades, Soviet newspapers and television programs began to openly discuss drug addiction. Journalists investigated the scope of the problem, interviewed addicts and their families, and criticized the inadequacy of government responses. This public discussion was unprecedented and shocking to many Soviet citizens who had genuinely believed the propaganda about their society's moral superiority over the decadent West. The revelation that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of Soviet citizens were struggling with drug addiction shattered another illusion about the socialist paradise. It was part of a broader pattern during the Gorbachev years, as one suppressed truth after another emerged into public view, eroding confidence in the system and contributing to the sense that fundamental change was necessary. But this new openness came too late to save the Soviet Union, and in some ways it accelerated its collapse. As the state weakened, as economic planning broke down, as the authority of the Communist Party eroded, all the social problems that had been contained or hidden by authoritarian control exploded into view. The drug trade was no exception. The borders that had become somewhat more secure during the Brezhnev era began to dissolve again as Soviet republics declared sovereignty and then independence. Criminal organizations, which had operated in the shadows of the command economy for decades, emerged as powerful actors in the chaos of the early 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 removed the last remaining barriers to drug trafficking. Russia, now an independent state struggling with economic collapse, political instability, and institutional breakdown, was overwhelmed by a drug epidemic that made the problems of the Soviet era seem modest by comparison. The 1990s were catastrophic for Russia in many ways, and the drug crisis was among the worst of them. Afghan heroin continued to flow north, now joined by synthetic drugs from European laboratories and cocaine from South America. The number of registered addicts exploded, reaching into the hundreds of thousands and then the millions. HIV infection rates, driven largely by intravenous drug use, soared to levels comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. Organized crime groups fought brutal wars for control of drug distribution networks, contributing to a general atmosphere of lawlessness and violence. The Russian government, struggling to pay salaries and maintain basic services, had few resources to devote to drug treatment or enforcement. The healthcare system, already weakened by decades of underinvestment, was overwhelmed by the demand for addiction services. Entire communities, particularly in Siberia and the Far East, were devastated by drug abuse. The social fabric that had held together, however imperfectly, during the Soviet era seemed to be disintegrating. This trajectory, from the chaos of the early revolutionary period through decades of official denial and inadequate response to the catastrophic crisis of the post-Soviet years, reveals fundamental truths about the Soviet system and its legacy. The Soviet state was built on the premise that it could engineer human society according to rational scientific principles, that it could eliminate the social problems that plagued capitalist countries through superior organization and ideological clarity. Drug addiction, like crime, prostitution, and homelessness, was supposed to disappear as socialism advanced. The persistence of these problems, their growth despite official denial, demonstrated the failure of that premise. The Soviet system could not eliminate drug addiction because drug addiction, like other forms of human suffering and self-destruction, has roots that go deeper than economic systems or political ideologies. It emerges from trauma, dislocation, despair, and the human need to escape unbearable realities. The Soviet Union created plenty of those realities even as it denied their existence. The legacy of Soviet drug policy continues to shape Russia and the former Soviet republics today. The inadequate treatment infrastructure, the stigmatization of addicts, the emphasis on punishment over rehabilitation, the weakness of border controls, the power of organized crime networks involved in drug trafficking, all of these are inheritances from the Soviet era. The current Russian government has made some efforts to address drug abuse, but it continues to struggle with many of the same problems that plagued its Soviet predecessor: insufficient resources, ideological rigidity, corruption, and a reluctance to acknowledge the full scale of the crisis. Meanwhile, Afghanistan continues to produce most of the world's opium, much of it still flowing north through the same routes established during the Soviet occupation. The war that helped create the modern drug crisis in the former Soviet Union ended more than 3 decades ago, but its consequences persist. Understanding this history matters because it challenges comfortable narratives about both the Soviet past and the post-Soviet present. It reveals that the Soviet Union, for all its claims of creating a new type of society, struggled with the same social problems as other modern states, and often handled them worse because of ideological constraints and authoritarian secrecy. It shows how decisions made for geopolitical reasons, like the invasion of Afghanistan, can have devastating unintended consequences that persist for generations. And it demonstrates that social problems cannot be solved by denial, that refusing to acknowledge a crisis does not make it disappear, but only allows it to grow in the darkness until it becomes unmanageable. The drug addicts of the Soviet Union were real people, hundreds of thousands of them, whose suffering was ignored or minimized by a state that claimed to serve their interests. Their stories, finally emerging from decades of official silence, stand as testimony to the gap between Soviet propaganda and Soviet reality, and as a warning about the costs of prioritizing ideology over truth.